The sun had not yet risen over the rolling fields of Blackwood Plantation when Catherine awoke, her chest tight with unease. Even in the dim light of her bedchamber she could feel the weight of the house pressing on her, the polished wood floors, the heavy curtains, the portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls, all witnesses to the quiet complicity she had long tolerated. Nathaniel Blackwood lay beside her, sleeping as though the horrors of the plantation were mere shadows beyond his control. But Catherine knew better. She had seen him at dawn in the slave quarters, examining women, noting the subtle variations in complexion, stature, and bearing. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the hall to the windows overlooking the fields. Mist clung to the cotton, softening the outlines of the enslaved people already at work. Some moved mechanically, their backs bent under the weight of labor. Others paused briefly to glance toward the main house, suspicion or fear in their eyes. Catherine's gaze fell on one woman in particular, Pearl, who carried herself with a careful dignity even while bending to her work. Pearl had become more than a servant to Catherine. She had become an unwitting confidant, forced into complicity yet quietly resistant. Nathaniel did not yet know she was awake. Catherine had learned to observe without being observed, to memorize every detail, every conversation, every ledger entry that documented the breeding plans. She had catalogued the names of the women selected, the children born and removed, the prices fetched at distant markets. Each page, each notation was another nail in the coffin of her husband's illusions of control. Yet the knowledge did little to ease her guilt. For years she had been powerless to intervene, forced to witness atrocities she could not stop. That morning the household stirred with an uneasy tension. The overseer arrived with instructions that Catherine knew were meant to test her compliance, though she had no choice but to maintain her posture of dutiful obedience. Nathaniel appeared later, a ledger tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the grounds as if measuring not the laborers, but Catherine herself. He paused by her door, his expression unreadable. "You will attend the birthing chamber today," he said, his voice cold. "I require your presence to ensure proper records are kept." Catherine nodded, keeping her voice low and controlled. "Yes, Nathaniel." Pearl emerged from the quarters soon after, her face pale but determined. She was to give birth, and Catherine knew what would follow. The clinical detachment, the methodical observations, the whispered calculations of which children would remain and which would be sold. Her stomach knotted at the thought, but she followed Pearl to the small chamber near the rear of the plantation house, keeping her hands folded in front of her, her mind racing with plans she could barely articulate. The labor was long. Pearl's cries echoed through the room, and Catherine's heart ached as she held a damp cloth to the woman's brow. Sweat slicked the baby's hairless body as it emerged, and Catherine's eyes fell on the fragile infant. A girl, small but vigorous, with skin lighter than her mother's, a delicate curl at the nape of her neck. Catherine wrapped the child in a blanket, pressing her briefly to her chest before handing her to Pearl. "Her name is Grace," Pearl whispered between shuddering breaths. Catherine's promise formed immediately in her mind, unspoken but absolute. She would protect this child. Whatever Nathaniel had built, whatever horrors he had sanctioned, at least this one life could be preserved. The thought hardened her resolve. She would confront him, document him, resist him in every way she could. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel entered the study to inspect the ledgers, noting characteristics, dates, and potential value of children born on the plantation. Catherine lingered near the doorway, watching him with barely contained rage. When he looked up, she spoke quietly but firmly. "This one stays. Pearl's child will not be sold." Nathaniel's lips curled in a thin smile. "That is not your decision, Catherine. It is mine." She stepped closer, voice unwavering. "If you override me, I will ensure the truth of your experiments reaches those who can act. Names, dates, transactions. I have documented everything, every child you have stolen, every woman violated, every correspondence with Colloway. Every ledger entry will be copied and delivered to authorities beyond your reach." He stared at her, a flicker of unease crossing his usual composure. Catherine held his gaze, seeing for the first time that even the most meticulous tyrant could hesitate. "You think you are practical enough to recognize a stalemate when you see one," she said. "One child. That is all I ask. Pearl's baby stays, and no more women will be selected for your experiments. What has been done cannot be undone, but we can stop the horrors from continuing." Nathaniel's expression hardened, then softened, then hardened again, as though weighing every possible retaliation against the certainty of exposure. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "Very well, you have won this battle, Catherine, but the war is far from over." Catherine's chest tightened, but she did not flinch. She had survived this confrontation, and Pearl's child was safe. The road ahead would be long, dangerous, and morally treacherous, but she had taken the first step. Outside the window, the cotton swayed gently in the morning breeze, and for the first time in months, Catherine allowed herself to imagine a future where one child, at least, might know a life without the shadow of Blackwood's cruelty. After the birth of Grace, the house at Blackwood Plantation settled into a fragile rhythm. Catherine moved through her days with a careful facade of obedience, hiding the storm of plans growing in her mind. Each ledger entry Nathaniel made, every conversation with his associates about Calloway's network, she memorized or copied in secret. She catalogued dates, transactions, and characteristics, creating a map of cruelty that could one day become evident. Pearl retreated to her cabin with Grace, exhausted but resolute. Catherine visited under the guise of companionship, sharing herbal teas, reading scraps of letters aloud, passing information quietly about the world beyond the plantation that might one day be useful to them. It was dangerous. Nathaniel watched her, studied her movements, and grew suspicious of the smallest deviation from routine, but she could not remain passive. 2 weeks after Grace's birth, Catherine found herself in the study, pretending to arrange the library, when she discovered a small clue she had overlooked: correspondence between Nathaniel and a man in Charleston, detailing not just sales, but instructions for selective pairing of enslaved women and men. Her stomach turned as she realized the scale of the operation. It was not mere cruelty, it was meticulously planned and ongoing. She needed allies, people outside the plantation who could intervene if she acted too boldly. Reverend Gaines, the local minister, had long been a moral presence, quietly condemning Nathaniel's more blatant abuses from the pulpit. Catherine drafted a plan. She would feed him carefully coded information, documenting every atrocity in a way that could withstand scrutiny, without tipping Nathaniel off. But communication needed discretion. Samuel, Nathaniel's 8-year-old son, was an unlikely participant. The boy had begun to notice the disparity between his father's words and actions, and the fear and sorrow etched into the faces of the enslaved people. One evening, he appeared at Pearl's cabin, carrying a folded piece of paper. "I want to help stop him," he whispered. "I can carry message. He does not watch me closely." Catherine's heart clenched. Samuel's life was at risk, yet he had chosen courage. "Yes," she said quietly, "but you must be careful. Every message you carry could be your last, and know that I am grateful for your bravery." From that day forward, a covert network formed. Samuel delivered messages between Catherine and Reverend Gaines, hiding them in borrowed books, retrieving responses hidden within volumes returned to the library. Each exchange was slow and perilous, but it allowed Catherine to pass copies of her meticulous documentation, building a dossier that could one day bring Nathaniel's crimes to light. Tension mounted with every day. Nathaniel grew suspicious, pacing the house with a predatory calm that made Catherine's pulse quicken. She could feel his gaze following her, noting when she lingered too long near Pearl's cabin, or when she lingered in the study. The weight of observation pressed down on her, yet she pressed forward, knowing that even a single child's life might depend on her courage. Then one crisp October morning, the fragile balance shattered. Catherine was in the garden when she heard shouting from the slave quarter. She ran toward the sound, finding Nathaniel towering over Samuel, his small son pressed to the dirt, a bloodied lip from the master's wrath. In his hand, a message Catherine had written, carelessly exposed. "You've been conspiring," Nathaniel hissed, his face flushed. "Sending messages about our private affairs to that meddling minister." Catherine stepped forward calmly, her mind racing. "I asked him to carry them. He was following my instructions." Nathaniel's hand shook with fury. "You admit?" "I admit nothing except protecting lives," Catherine said steadily. "Every woman you violated, every child stolen, every transaction with Calloway documented. Copies have been given to Reverend Gaines, who will ensure they reach those who can act." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Nathaniel's face. He understood, perhaps, that he could not silence her completely without risking exposure. His grip on the plantation, on the social structures around him, was less absolute than he had believed. "Very well," he said at last, voice low, grudging. "One child remains. But know this, Catherine, the war is far from over." Catherine exhaled, a cold relief settling in her chest. Grace was safe, Pearl and Ruth could breathe more easily, and Samuel would continue his education. But the fight had only just begun. Over the coming weeks, she redoubled her efforts to document every atrocity, passing copies to Reverend Gaines for safekeeping. The network of hidden testimony grew, small scraps of paper in secret, notes in diaries, letters hidden in church hymns. Every record was a weapon, every word a shield. By winter, the plantation had become a tense chessboard. Nathaniel maintained his dominance through intimidation and surveillance, but Catherine's quiet resistance was now an immutable force. For the enslaved people, the knowledge that someone in the house, their white mistress, had begun to act on their behalf, offered a small but profound sense of hope. They had survived the worst, and now perhaps their suffering might be mitigated, if only slight. Catherine understood the stakes. Each day carried the risk of exposure, of ruin, of personal harm, but the ledger of cruelty she kept, the letters smuggled through Samuel, and the witness of Pearl and Ruth represented a truth that could not be silenced forever. The small victories, the safety of grace, the beginnings of Samuel's education, the clandestine literacy lessons Catherine provided were fragile and incomplete, yet they were real. In the shadow of Blackwood Plantation, Catherine began the long, dangerous work of transforming knowledge into resistance, of turning documentation into a weapon against one of the most calculated systems of human exploitation she had ever witnessed. She could not undo the past, nor could she restore the stolen childhoods of those already lost, but she could act, and in that action lay the faint glimmer of justice. Winter descended on Sweetwater Plantation with a stark, icy clarity, blanketing the fields and the vast house in white. The chill did nothing to dampen the tension that had taken root inside the walls of the main house. Catherine moved cautiously, each step a calculated negotiation between obedience and resistance. Nathaniel, her husband, had maintained the fragile truce, allowing no more women to be taken and no more children to be sold. Yet his presence was a constant shadow, a reminder of the danger that lingered in every corner. For Catherine, the victory of Grace's survival and the halting of the breeding program was only the beginning. She knew the threat of Nathaniel's influence, of Callaway's networks, extended far beyond Sweetwater. One misstep, one overlooked ledger, could unravel the careful web she had woven over months. She had become a master of subtlety. The smallest movement in the kitchen, a whispered word to Pearl, a page tucked into a hymn book, all carried messages that, if interpreted correctly, could shape the fate of the children and enslaved people whose lives were caught in Nathaniel's cruel experiment. Samuel had grown bolder, emboldened by Catherine's steady guidance. The boy's intelligence, once playful and curious, had hardened into a precise awareness of danger and opportunity. At 10 years old, he was already calculating risk, learning to read ledger entries with a meticulous eye, memorizing details that would later serve as ammunition against his father's crimes. Catherine's eyes often followed him with a mixture of fear and pride. She knew the burden she had placed on him, the impossible knowledge of the world he was forced to confront, but she also understood that in him lay the potential for a future Nathaniel could never fully control. One evening, as the wind howled through the cotton fields, Catherine sat in the main parlor with Pearl and Ruth, planning the next steps. The three women, bound together by trauma and survival, leaned over a table littered with scraps of paper, hidden ledgers and carefully folded notes. Each page represented a fragment of truth, a piece of evidence that could, one day, dismantle the carefully constructed world Nathaniel had created. "We have to get this outside," Catherine whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "Gaines can only do so much from Milledgeville. There are people in Savannah, in Charleston, who might actually intervene if we can prove what's happening here is part of a network, not isolated cruelty." Pearl nodded, holding Grace close. "I've written everything I can remember about the women taken before me. Every child, every ledger entry. If anything happens to you, Mrs. Catherine, these papers will speak." Ruth, always quieter, looked from Catherine to Pearl, her eyes dark with the memory of her own stolen child. "And Samuel?" she asked softly. "The boy carries the messages, but he is still a child." "If Nathaniel suspects him," Catherine placed a hand over Ruth's. "I know, we will protect him. He is careful and he knows what is at stake. But yes, every day is a risk." She paused, letting the gravity of their situation settle. "We cannot wait for perfect conditions. We act with what we have." The next day, Catherine enacted a new layer of subtlety. While Nathaniel remained occupied with overseers and bookkeeping, she slipped pages of copied ledgers into the bindings of books Samuel borrowed from the library. She marked the volumes with tiny, nearly imperceptible signs, scratches on the spine, an ink dot on a corner that Samuel could recognize. These were lifelines, conduits of truth, that Nathaniel could not monitor without suspicion. 2 weeks later, the fragile system was tested. Nathaniel had noticed irregularities. Books moved, papers slightly askew. Suspicion churned in his sharp, calculating mind. One afternoon, he intercepted Samuel in the library, the boy's small hands trembling, as he clutched a volume containing one of Catherine's copies. You think I do not see? Nathaniel demanded, his voice a low growl, a mix of fury and disbelief. Do you understand what you are doing, boy? You endanger yourself and her. Samuel's eyes, gray and unnervingly mature for his age, met his father's without flinching. I know what you planned for me, Father. I know what you wanted. I am not that child, he said quietly, though every word trembled with tension. Nathaniel's hand rose, not to strike but as if to impose terror through sheer presence. Do you realize the betrayal in which you participate? Your mother's complicity, this conspiracy, it will destroy us all if I cannot control it. Catherine appeared at the doorway, her face calm but her heart hammering. He is following my instructions, she said plainly. Every message, every note, has been for the purpose of ensuring no more harm comes to these children. Grace is safe. Samuel will continue to learn. That is what matters. Nathaniel's face shifted through a range of emotions. Rage, disbelief, calculation. For the first time the certainty that had governed him for so long faltered. He understood in some cold calculation that silence no longer guaranteed control. The ledger of cruelty, once private, had become public in potential. Very well, he said finally, his voice tight. One child remains safe. But know this, your defiance has consequences. The war is not over. The days that followed were a tense stalemate. Nathaniel maintained his authority through intimidation, but Catherine's quiet resistance became a force he could not fully suppress. She monitored every interaction, every ledger entry, ensuring that copies reached Reverend Gaines without detection. Samuel's participation was invaluable, and the boy learned to navigate the treacherous terrain with cautious precision. By spring, the plantation's atmosphere had changed subtly. The enslaved people sensed a shift, hope, however fragile, that at least some protection existed. Pearl taught Grace to read in secret, whispering lessons that were forbidden yet essential. Ruth held Martha close, shielding her from the worst of the plantation's cruelty, while Catherine orchestrated the clandestine network of documentation. Then in late May, news arrived that altered everything. Reverend Gaines, having conveyed parts of Catherine's documentation to trusted contacts in Savannah and Charleston, reported that federal authorities were investigating transactions linked to Callaway. The network of child trafficking, once hidden, had drawn scrutiny. Plantation owners associated with the trade had fled, letters intercepted, and ledgers confiscated. The shadow of Nathaniel's crimes extended far beyond Sweetwater, and the consequences were becoming tangible. Nathaniel, already weakened by stress and the slow erosion of his authority, began to falter. Catherine watched with a detached vigilance as the man who had terrorized her household showed signs of physical decline. She felt no triumph, only the grim understanding that survival, even partial, had come at immense cost. In October, a confrontation that had been long anticipated finally arrived. Nathaniel, sensing the threat to his legacy, confronted Catherine directly in the main parlor. You have been building a case against me, he said, voice shaking with suppressed fury. Do you truly believe you can destroy me without consequence? Catherine's gaze was steady. I have already documented everything. If anything happens to me, the evidence will reach those who can act. You have controlled this house, this plantation, but you do not control the truth. Nathaniel's hand twitched as if reaching for control, but the reality of his vulnerability was clear. He had no allies outside the plantation capable of defending his secret network, no means of suppressing the documentation Catherine and the enslaved people had compiled. For the first time, he realized that his calculated cruelty could be exposed, his experiments laid bare for the world to see. You think this ends today? He asked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the uncertainty beneath. Yes, Catherine said simply. No more women will be taken, no more children stolen. Grace will grow, Samuel will learn, and those who were already harmed will have their stories preserved. This is the only victory you cannot undo. Nathaniel stood in silence, the weight of decades of cruelty pressing down on him. He understood that despite his position, he was now constrained by the very truth he had tried to manipulate. The stalemate was absolute. Catherine would no longer be silent, and exposure loomed over every decision he made. By the end of the year, Nathaniel's health had deteriorated significantly. Catherine continued her careful oversight, ensuring the well-being of those in the plantation's care, and quietly preparing for the eventual reckoning that would come with documentation made public. Samuel's education progressed under her guidance. Pearl and Grace's clandestine literacy lessons flourished, and Ruth found some measure of solace in protecting Martha. The story of Sweetwater, however, was far from complete. What Catherine, Pearl, Ruth, and Samuel had created, this network of resistance, observation, and documentation, would endure long after Nathaniel's death. The letters, ledgers, and diaries became a testament to survival, courage, and the power of truth in a world designed to suppress. Though the immediate horrors could not be undone, and the fates of many children lost to the trafficking network remained unknown, the careful record-keeping ensured that the history of Sweetwater would one day be revealed. What Catherine could not save physically, she preserved in ink and memory, a final act of defiance against the machinery of cruelty. The plantation, the house, and the lives within it were forever altered, but for the first time in years there was a glimmer of hope that the truth and perhaps a measure of justice would survive. The years following Nathaniel's confrontation with Catherine moved slowly, each day a tense negotiation of survival and quiet resistance. Sweetwater Plantation, once a place defined by fear, terror, and ruthless control, had become a house of fragile order. Nathaniel, who had ruled with absolute authority for so long, now spent his days in declining health, his mind as brittle as his body. Catherine observed him from a distance, noting the subtle signs of heart strain, fatigue, and the creeping realization that his empire of cruelty had limits. By 1841, Nathaniel could barely ascend the stairs to his study without stopping, gasping for breath. The foxglove poisoning Catherine had administered months earlier, subtle and calculated, had taken its toll on his heart. She did not gloat. Hatred had long since cooled to a neutral emptiness. She simply maintained vigilance, ensuring that his decline did not compromise the safety of the children or the enslaved people under her care. Pearl continued raising Grace in secrecy, teaching the girl to read and write in stolen moments. The clandestine lessons were acts of defiance, small victories that offered the girl a glimpse of autonomy and a future that could perhaps be different from the one Nathaniel had meticulously planned. Ruth kept Martha close, teaching her what she could, while shielding her from the remnants of the plantation's terror. Each woman carried her own trauma, yet they acted in concert, creating a network of subtle protection that Nathaniel could not penetrate. Samuel, growing from 10 to 15 over these years, became increasingly aware of the power of knowledge. Catherine taught him not only reading and arithmetic, but the careful logic of observation and documentation. Knowledge is armor, she told him one afternoon, and a sword. It protects you, and those who cannot defend themselves. Use it wisely. The boy absorbed every lesson with a focus that made even Catherine wary. She knew that with every step he took toward understanding, the risk of discovery increased, but so did the possibility of eventual justice. In 1842, Nathaniel largely withdrew from public life, confining himself to the study and relying on overseers to manage the plantation's day-to-day operations. The stalemate Catherine had negotiated became more pronounced. He could not act openly without risking exposure, and yet he retained enough authority to make her life miserable in subtle ways. He withheld money, restricted her social interactions, and excluded her from any decision-making beyond the immediate survival of the plantation. Every insult, every deprivation, was a reminder that she remained trapped, not by fear alone, but by the legal and social systems that enabled his control. The breakthrough came unexpected. In 1843, a federal investigation into child trafficking linked to Calloway's network began to intersect with the documentation Catherine and Samuel had secretly compiled. Letters, ledgers, and records that traced the sale and movement of enslaved children were now in the hands of authority. The reach of Sweetwater's horrors extended far beyond its cotton fields, and Catherine realized that the carefully preserved evidence could finally have a real-world impact. Nathaniel, sensing a storm he could not control, became increasingly irritable and withdrawn. By the spring of 1843, his health had deteriorated to the point that he could no longer manage even the simplest tasks. Catherine's role shifted from subtle resistance to direct oversight. She managed the plantation with quiet efficiency, balancing the demands of survival, the welfare of the enslaved people, and the looming presence of her husband's volatile temperament. In March of 18, the official cause was listed as heart failure, which, given the slow damage Catherine's poison had wrought, was not inaccurate. He was 39 years old. Catherine attended his burial in the family cemetery with a cold detachment, standing silently as he was lowered into the earth. Relief, not sorrow, marked her emotions. The man who had orchestrated such profound suffering was finally gone, and yet the work of repair and remembrance remained. Nathaniel's will, written in the final year of his life, left Sweetwater to Catherine, with explicit instructions for Samuel's education and eventual manumission. It was a begrudging acknowledgement of Samuel's existence, likely motivated less by affection than by a desire to test the theory he had imposed on his children, that a child born under such circumstances could thrive as a free man. Catherine accepted the terms pragmatically. The result, she knew, was what mattered. Samuel would be freed. The others might have a chance at lives not dictated by Nathaniel's cruelty. Catherine spent the following decade carefully managing Sweetwater. She never remarried, focusing instead on the small acts of justice she could enact. She established a clandestine school where children could learn to read and write, knowing it was illegal but understanding its necessity. She saved money to purchase freedom for Pearl and Grace in 1849, sending them north with letters of introduction to Quaker families in Philadelphia. The girls were free, carrying knowledge, skills and hope, though the trauma of their early years would follow them forever. Ruth chose to remain at Sweetwater with Martha. The plantation, though a sight of horrors past, was the only home she had ever known, and the uncertainty of freedom frightened her more than the memory of slavery. Catherine understood, respecting the choice while continuing to protect the girls' well-being. Samuel's education proceeded under her direct supervision, ensuring that when he turned 21 in 1851, he would be fully prepared to navigate a world that had never been designed to accept him. When Samuel left Sweetwater, he carried with him copies of Catherine's records, ledgers, diaries, and letters documenting the crimes and networks Nathaniel had orchestrated. "You are not defined by how you began," Catherine told him. "You can be whoever you choose to become." Samuel took the papers, leaving Georgia with a determination that would carry him far from the horrors of Sweetwater. He eventually built a life in Philadelphia under an assumed name, marrying a free black woman, and raising children who would never know the full weight of their grandfather's crimes. Catherine herself grew increasingly frail as the years of vigilance, trauma and stress had taken a visible toll. By 1854 she sensed her own death approaching. Consumption, the doctor said, though Catherine felt it was a deeper exhaustion of spirit manifesting in the body. In her final weeks, she organized all the documentation she had accumulated, ensuring that future generations would know the truth of Sweetwater. She sealed ledgers, letters, and her diary in a box, instructing her lawyer to preserve it for a century. "The world is not ready," she wrote, "but it must eventually know." Catherine died on May 3rd. She was buried beside Nathaniel, a bitter irony not lost on her, but the terms of her will ensured that the land of Sweetwater would eventually be distributed among the remaining enslaved people, granting them ownership of small parcels. Legal challenges from distant relatives complicated the process, but the seeds of justice, however fragile, had been planted. The main house burned in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ended. The cause, whether accident, arson, or deliberate destruction, was never recorded. The slave quarters were dismantled, their lumber repurposed, and the land subdivided. Sweetwater faded from memory, its horrors erased from the local landscape, though preserved meticulously in the box Catherine had sealed. In 1954, the University of Georgia historian Margaret Fletcher discovered the box while researching plantation records for her dissertation. The documents revealed, in chilling detail, the scope of Nathaniel's breeding program, the complicity and eventual resistance of Catherine, and the experiences of Pearl, Ruth, Grace, and Fletcher's dissertation, later published as Sweetwater, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in Antebellum, Georgia, caused controversy but preserved the truth for future generations. Descendants of Samuel, Pearl, and Ruth, upon reading Fletcher's work, connected with their family histories for the first time. Samuel's grandson, Robert Cunningham, learned why his grandfather had been silent about his past. Pearl's granddaughter in Boston shared stories passed down through oral history, adding depth to the written records. Ruth's lineage, scattered by migration, was harder to trace, though fragments of their lives persisted. Grace, tragically, had no descendants, leaving only the memory of her suffering preserved in Catherine's diary. Sweetwater became a symbol, a warning of the depths of cruelty human beings can impose, and the resilience of those who resist. The land itself, divided among small farms and partially within Oconee National Forest, bore no markers of its history, no memorials to the women and children whose lives had been torn apart. Yet the records remained, a testament to survival, defiance, and the slow, eventual triumph of truth over secrecy. Reverend Brennan, once a complicit wife, had used the limited power she possessed to save what she could, and ensure that history would not forget. Samuel, Pearl, Ruth, and Grace, though scarred by what they endured, became living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, acts of courage,
documentation and resistance could endure across generations. Sweetwater's story, painful and complex, serves as a reminder that remembering is not a passive act, but an essential tool for justice, reflection, and the ongoing struggle against oppression. In the quiet of modern Baldwin County, hikers occasionally stumble across the overgrown cemetery, or the remnants of Sweetwater's foundations. The air carries no memory of screams, no echo of stolen children, yet the documents, preserved and studied, continue to whisper the truth. And in that truth, the lives and voices of Catherine, Samuel, Pearl, Ruth, and Grace remain unbroken, demanding that history bear witness, no matter how long it takes.
Decades passed, and the land that had once been Sweetwater Plantation changed hands many times. Fields were replanted, homes built and abandoned, and the memory of the atrocities committed there faded from public knowledge. By the turn of the 20th century, the plantation had been reduced to little more than overgrown foundations and a neglected cemetery. Most locals had no idea what had happened there, and those who remembered the stories of Nathaniel Brennan and his family did so only as whispered tales of cruelty, too horrific for polite conversation. Yet the records Catherine had preserved, her diaries, Nathaniel's ledgers, letters from Callaway's network, and Pearl's own hidden notes, remained carefully stored in the Baldwin County Courthouse. For nearly a century, the documents sat largely forgotten, catalogued but untouched, their full meaning inaccessible to all but the archivists who ensured their preservation. The century-long seal she had imposed on the box had achieved exactly what she intended. The truth of Sweetwater would be protected from prying eyes until a time when it could be revealed responsibly. In 1954, a young historian from the University of Georgia, Margaret Fletcher, was researching Antebellum plantation records for her dissertation. Fletcher had spent months combing through property deeds, tax records, and legal filings, searching for patterns of wealth accumulation, crop production, and social networks in the antebellum South. When a courthouse clerk mentioned a sealed box labeled with the date of 1854 and Catherine Brennan's name, Fletcher's curiosity was immediate. After confirming that the 100-year seal had elapsed, the box was brought to her attention. Opening it was a carefully orchestrated process. Fletcher, with gloves and archival tools, lifted the layers of parchment, sealing wax, and dust-covered ledgers to reveal the painstaking work Catherine had left behind. The diary, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, chronicled daily life on Sweetwater, the mechanics of Nathaniel's breeding program, and the suffering endured by the enslaved women and children. Nathaniel's ledgers listed names, dates, and locations of children taken or sold, recorded with the cold precision of a scientist documenting a controlled experiment. Pearl's hidden notes, written in tiny script on scraps of paper, provided first-person testimony of life under Nathaniel's cruelty, adding human voices to the bureaucratic horrors. Fletcher knew immediately that what she had discovered was unlike anything she had encountered. The depth of cruelty, the systematic nature of the trafficking, and the complicity of otherwise respectable members of society were all meticulously documented. Initially, she hesitated to publish. The material was too disturbing, too inflammatory, and she worried about backlash from both descendants of the Brennan family and the broader academic community. Yet her advisors reminded her that primary sources of this kind, painful though they were, must be preserved and analyzed. History demanded acknowledgement, no matter how uncomfortable. Her dissertation, completed in 1956, included extensive excerpts from Catherine's diary, Nathaniel's ledgers, and the letters connecting the trafficking network. In 1958, it was published by a university press under the title Sweetwater, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in Antebellum, Georgia. The book sparked immediate controversy. Some praised Fletcher's work for shedding light on an extreme but historically accurate example of the intersection of pseudoscience and slavery. Others criticized it as sensationalistic, claiming it focused on outliers and was not representative of typical plantation practices. Descendants of the Brennan family attempted to suppress the publication, claiming defamation, but the meticulous documentation left no room for doubt. The crimes had occurred. The revelation of Sweetwater's history rippled through both academic and public sphere. Researchers began to recognize patterns in other plantations, finding evidence of similar breeding programs and systematic child trafficking. The notion that such atrocities were isolated incidents crumbled under the weight of Catherine's record. Sweetwater became a case study not only in cruelty, but in the complicity of social, legal, and scientific systems in perpetuating oppression. Samuel's descendants learned of their family's origins from Fletcher's work. His grandson, Robert Cunningham, now a physician in Philadelphia, was stunned. He finally understood why his grandfather had been silent about his childhood, why a shadow of grief had always lingered beneath the surface of his successful life. Robert wrote to Fletcher, expressing gratitude that she had preserved the truth, painful though it was, and provided additional family records that helped researchers trace Samuel's life after leaving Georgia. Pearl's granddaughter, a teacher in Boston, also reached out to Fletcher. She shared the oral histories Pearl had passed down, stories of Catherine, Ruth, and the quiet acts of defiance that sustained them. These oral narratives, combined with the written documents, created a fuller picture of life on Sweetwater and the ways enslaved people navigated terror and oppression. Ruth's descendants were harder to locate. Martha had remained in Georgia and had children, but the family scattered during the early 20th century's Great Migration. Some researchers believed they had identified a great-granddaughter in Detroit in the 1970s, though the connection could never be definitively confirmed. Grace, tragically, left no descendants, her suffering surviving only in Catherine's meticulous notation. The story of Sweetwater forced historians, students, and the public to confront the uncomfortable reality that the horrors of slavery were not only about forced labor, but also about the manipulation of human lives under the guise of progress and science. Nathaniel's breeding program exemplified the extremes of a system that sought to reduce people to property and instruments of study, while Catherine's delayed intervention highlighted the moral complexity of complicity and resistance. She had waited too long to act, yet her courage and foresight in preserving the records ensured that the truth would survive, even if it took a century to emerge. The physical land of Sweetwater became largely unrecognizable. Sections were incorporated into small farms, some fell within the borders of Oconee National Forest, and the overgrown cemetery became a hidden fragment of history. Hikers occasionally stumbled across broken gravestones or the remnants of the main house's foundation, though the events that had transpired there were no longer remembered by the local community. There were no memorials, no plaques, no acknowledgement of the women who had been violated, the children who had been stolen, or the lives destroyed by Nathaniel's experiments and Catherine's delayed action. Yet the documents persisted, held in university archives, studied by historians, and taught in classrooms as essential, if disturbing, reminders of what human beings are capable of when power goes unchecked. They also served as a testament to resistance, however delayed, and to the importance of bearing witness. Through the meticulous preservation of diaries, ledgers, letters, and oral histories, the voices of Catherine, Samuel, Pearl, Ruth, and Grace continued to speak across centuries. By the late 20th century, Sweetwater was no longer just a forgotten plantation. It had become a symbol of accountability and historical memory. Researchers examined the documents not only to understand the mechanics of slavery, but also to explore the moral and ethical questions posed by complicity, resistance, and the preservation of truth. Catherine's legacy, complex and morally ambiguous, offered a model for grappling with historical horrors, acknowledging one's own delayed action, documenting atrocities meticulously, and using whatever limited power one possesses to prevent further suffering. The story of Sweetwater, and the documents that recorded it, continues to resonate. Students encounter excerpts in history classes, historians cite the diaries in research, and descendants trace their ancestry through the meticulous records Catherine left behind. The truth, painful as it is, serves as a warning. Unchecked power, rationalized cruelty, and human complicity can produce horrors that extend far beyond immediate victim. At the same time, the courage to resist, even belatedly, can preserve life, dignity, and the historical record for future generations. In the shadows of Baldwin County, the remnants of Sweetwater stand silent. The overgrown cemetery, the foundations hidden beneath vines, the scattered land, all testify to a history once hidden, now partially recovered. The voices of those who suffered, and those who resisted, continue to echo through the preserved documents. And in those echoes, the past confronts the present, reminding us that remembering even the most painful truths is an act of justice. Catherine Brennan, once a passive participant in the machinery of cruelty, had transformed into a chronicler, a protector, and a moral agent within the limits of her power. Samuel, Pearl, Ruth, and Grace, though scarred by their experiences, carried fragments of freedom, knowledge, and possibility into their futures. Sweetwater, long forgotten by the landscape, remained alive in records, research, and the consciousness of those willing to face its truth. It was, in the end, a story of cruelty, complicity, resistance, survival, and the enduring power of truth. By the late 20th century, the story of Sweetwater Plantation had moved from archival obscurity into public consciousness. The publication of Margaret Fletcher's Sweetwater, in 1958, had opened a window not just into the abuses of one plantation, but into the broader, systemic exploitation that slavery enabled. Historians now recognized that what occurred at Sweetwater was not an anomaly. Across the South, children had been stolen, women coerced, and scientific rationalizations applied to justify crimes against humanity. Sweetwater became a case study in the interplay of pseudoscience, power, and human cruelty, and Reverend Brennan's meticulous documentation emerged as the moral backbone of the historical narrative. Fletcher's work prompted a wave of research that sought to uncover similar programs elsewhere. Archives across Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana revealed other instances of forced breeding, trafficking, and the use of enslaved children as experiments in lineage, productivity, or temperament. Scholars began to reconstruct these networks, revealing a disturbing web of complicity among plantation owners, doctors, and local officials, who allowed, sometimes encouraged, such practices. Sweetwater became a benchmark, a reference point by which to judge the moral, social, and scientific failures of antebellum society. The story resonated far beyond academia. University history courses incorporated excerpts from Catherine's diaries, Nathaniel's ledgers, and Pearl's hidden note. Students read, not just to understand slavery as an economic system, but to confront the human cost of treating people as property, as tools, and as subjects of curiosity. The material challenged them to wrestle with questions of morality, complicity, and agency. What does it mean to witness evil and fail to act? When is delayed resistance still meaningful? And what responsibility do those who survive atrocities have toward those who did not? Reverend Brennan's life provided a deeply human lens to explore these questions. Historians also revisited the ethics of documentation and memory. Catherine had lived in moral ambiguity. She had been complicit for months, delayed in acting, and benefited from a system that allowed Nathaniel to commit crime. Yet her eventual choices, documenting, preserving, and eventually acting to stop further harm, showed the importance of bearing witness. Modern scholars argued that historical memory depended as much on these acts of preservation as on acts of heroism. Without Catherine's diary, the systematic abuses of Sweetwater might have been permanently lost, leaving only fragmented oral histories or speculation. In preserving the evidence, she ensured that the atrocities could not be erased, even if the full weight of culpability was delayed. Public history initiatives also emerged. Baldwin County, for the first time, hosted small exhibits in the local museum and courthouse, highlighting Sweetwater's story. Researchers and descendants organized conferences to discuss the intersections of slavery, science, and complicity, often drawing moral lessons for contemporary society. Discussions emphasized not only the crimes committed, but the ways in which societal structures and bureaucracies could perpetuate injustice, even when individuals disagreed privately. Sweetwater became a cautionary tale, a reminder that legality does not equate to morality, and that complicity often hides in plain sight. Samuel's descendants, particularly Robert Cunningham and his family, participated in these initiatives. They shared oral histories and family reflections, bridging the gap between archival research and living memory. Samuel's children, and later grandchildren, had grown up largely unaware of the specific horrors of their grandfather's childhood, though they carried its emotional imprint. Fletcher's research allowed them to confront that history openly, to reconcile grief, pride, and loss, and to contribute to the collective understanding of slavery's enduring impact. Pearl's descendants, scattered across northern cities, also engaged with the history, using it to educate and advocate for social justice. The physical remnants of Sweetwater became part of a layered memoryscape. Though the main house had burned in 1867 and the slave quarters dismantled, traces remained in the foundation stones, the overgrown cemetery, and fragments of landscape still visible amid the kudzu and forest. Archaeologists occasionally conducted surveys, uncovering artifacts such as broken ceramics, nails, and remnants of personal items. Each discovery was treated with reverence, a tangible link to lives lived in oppression and resilience. The land itself, once a site of terror, became a place of remembrance. Small memorials and plaques were eventually installed by local historians and descendants, acknowledging the enslaved people whose lives were violated, the children stolen, and the women whose agency was suppressed. Sweetwater's story also sparked ethical debates in modern historiography. How should historians present such extreme cruelty without sensationalizing it? How do they honor the memory of victims while acknowledging the flawed humanity of witnesses like Cath Fletcher's work and subsequent scholarship emphasized that understanding moral ambiguity is essential? Catherine's delayed action and eventual intervention offered lessons in both the limitations and possibilities of individual agency within oppressive systems. Her choice to preserve records, even at personal risk, provided a template for how historical memory can be safeguarded, ensuring that the voices of the oppressed are heard across generations. In the classroom, Sweetwater was presented as a microcosm of slavery's brutality and complexity. Students analyzed Nathaniel's ledgers,
noting the cold rationality applied to human lives. They read Catherine's diary and Pearl's notes, observing the emotional, moral, and practical consequences of complicity and delayed resistance. Discussions often became deeply personal, with students reflecting on what they might do in similar circumstances, how power dynamics influence choices, and how history forces us to confront uncomfortable truth. In this way, Sweetwater transcended its geographic and temporal boundaries, offering lessons relevant to ethics, social justice, and historical responsibility today. The story also highlighted the intergenerational impact of trauma. Samuel, Pearl, and Ruth carried the scars of their experiences throughout their lives. Samuel's success in Philadelphia masked the grief and unresolved pain from his childhood. Pearl's family narratives included both pride in survival and sorrow for what had been lost. Martha's descendants, though scattered, inherited cultural and emotional legacies, shaped by slavery's brutal realities. Sweetwater became a case study in how trauma propagates across generations, affecting family identity, memory, and resilience. Yet the narrative of Sweetwater is not one of despair alone. It is also a story of survival, resistance, and the preservation of truth. Catherine's eventual intervention stopped further atrocities. Samuel, Pearl, and Ruth survived, and some achieved freedom and stability. Their descendants, armed with knowledge of their history, could confront and contextualize their past. The documents, diaries, and ledgers, once hidden and feared, became instruments of education, memory, and justice. They allowed society to witness cruelty honestly and to understand the resilience required to resist it, even partially or belatedly. Today, the legacy of Sweetwater continues to evolve. Researchers study the documents to trace patterns of trafficking, abuse, and resist. Oral histories supplement written records, providing insight into lived experiences. Museums and historical societies use Catherine's diaries to illustrate the human consequences of pseudoscience applied to oppression. Educators present Sweetwater as a case study in ethics, historical memory, and the power of documentation. And descendants of those affected by Sweetwater, through Samuel, Pearl, and Ruth, engage with the history, ensuring that the voices of the enslaved are not lost to time. Sweetwater, long hidden beneath layers of forest, bureaucracy, and silence, now exists as both a cautionary tale and a testament. It reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary cruelty when systems support and rationalize it, but also capable of courage, resistance, and the preservation of truth. Catherine Brennan's story is morally complex, reflecting the challenges of agency under oppression. Nathaniel's horrors demonstrate the dangers of unchecked power and pseudo-scientific rationalizations. The descendants' engagement highlights the enduring impact of historical trauma and the importance of confronting it honestly. In the end, Sweetwater's legacy is not one of redemption or closure, but of remembrance. The land may have been subdivided, the main house lost, and the slave quarters dismantled, but the truth remains preserved in documents, oral histories, and the scholarship they inspire. Visitors to Baldwin County, students studying Catherine's diaries, and descendants of those affected by Sweetwater, all participate in an ongoing dialogue with history, a dialogue that insists on recognition of both suffering and resilience. Sweetwater's story serves as a mirror for contemporary society, reflecting the consequences of systemic oppression and the moral responsibilities of those who witness injustice. It teaches that remembering even the most painful truths is essential, that complicity must be acknowledged, and that the preservation of evidence can ensure that justice, however delayed, is possible. The echoes of Sweetwater persist in every record, every story, and every lesson drawn from its history. The lives of those who suffered there, and those who acted to resist, continue to shape our understanding of morality, power, and human responsibility. In remembering Sweetwater, society confronts the extremes of human cruelty, while also honoring acts of courage and resistance. It stands as a warning, a lesson, and a memorial, ensuring that the past, no matter how painful, is never forgotten.
The story of Sweetwater Plantation did not end with the publication of Fletcher's book. Over the decades, as historians, genealogists, and activists delved into the archives, the implications of Catherine Brennan's records reverberated far beyond Baldwin County. Sweetwater became a lens through which the American public could understand the depths of cruelty inflicted under slavery, the rationalizations used to justify it, and the ways in which ordinary individuals, complicit, hesitant, or courageous, could influence outcomes, however partially. In the 1960s and 1970s, during the civil rights movement, Less work experienced a resurgence. Scholars cited Sweetwater as evidence of how systemic oppression had been meticulously organized and maintained, long before the advent of modern racial policies or Jim Crow laws. Educators and civil rights advocates highlighted Catherine Brennan's diaries as examples of historical resistance, emphasizing that even those with limited agency could act in ways that mattered. In classrooms and lecture halls, Sweetwater became a case study not merely in slavery, but in moral responsibility, complicity, and the documentation of injustice. Genealogists traced descendants of Sweetwater's enslaved people, piecing together fragmented family trees from Catherine's records, Pearl's notes, and oral histories. Families who had lost knowledge of their ancestors' origins began to reconnect with long-lost branches of kinship. Samuel's descendants in Philadelphia, Pearl's in Boston, and Martha's scattered lineages in Detroit and Atlanta found tangible links to their past. For many, the discovery was deeply emotional. The mixture of horror at what had been endured, pride in survival, and gratitude for Catherine's documentation. The act of reclaiming history became an act of reclaiming identity. Museums and historical societies began incorporating Sweetwater into exhibits on slavery, human trafficking, and pseudo-scientific exploitation. Artifacts, maps, and reproductions of Catherine's diaries were displayed alongside contemporary commentary, emphasizing the human cost behind the dry numbers and ledgers Nathaniel had kept. Visitors were often struck by the contrast between Nathaniel's cold calculations and Catherine's emotional, painstaking records of suffering. It created a visceral understanding of the psychological and moral dimensions of slavery, that oppression was not just physical, but administrative, bureaucratic, and scientific in its cold rationality. In the 1980s and 1990s, documentaries and media coverage brought Sweetwater to a broader audience. Public television programs highlighted Fletcher's research and featured interviews with historians and descendants. Catherine Brennan's moral complexity became a point of discussion. Commentators debated her delay in action, her complicity in Nathaniel's crimes, and the courage she displayed once she chose to intervene. These discussions extended into broader ethical debates about responsibility under oppressive systems, asking contemporary viewers to consider what choices they might make in similarly constrained circumstances. Archaeological surveys of the Sweetwater site intensified in the late 20s. While the main house had long since burned and slave quarters dismantled, teams unearthed remnants of domestic life, fragments of pottery, nails, personal items, and traces of foundations. The cemetery, overgrown but still intact, offered further evidence of the lives once lived there. Researchers treated each discovery with care, aware that these material remains were often the only tangible connection to people whose experiences were otherwise erased. Public archaeology programs invited local communities, descendants, and students to participate, transforming Sweetwater into both a site of memory and a locus of learning. Scholars emphasized that Sweetwater was not an isolated story. Patterns of forced breeding, child trafficking, and systemic manipulation of enslaved families were documented elsewhere, revealing the widespread nature of such abuses. Sweetwater became emblematic of how pseudoscience had been mobilized to justify atrocities, a chilling illustration of how intellectual authority could be abused. The meticulous preservation of records, delayed as it was, became a vital lesson in how evidence could survive, informing contemporary understandings of human rights violations and historical justice. Ethicists and historians alike drew lessons from Catherine Brennan's moral ambivalence. She was neither wholly heroic nor entirely complicit. She was human, flawed, and constrained by societal expectations, legal limitations, and fear. Yet her actions demonstrated that even those who hesitate or fail initially can still affect outcome. Catherine's choice to document, preserve, and eventually intervene became a focal point for discussions about historical responsibility, moral courage, and the importance of record-keeping. Her story challenged simplistic notions of good and evil, showing how complex human decisions can be within systems designed to dehumanize. Descendants of Sweetwater's survivors engaged with this history in deeply personal ways. Some wrote memoirs, tracing the impact of slavery across generations. Others worked to preserve remaining documents, reconcile fragmented family histories, and educate communities about their ancestors' experience. Oral histories passed down through families, combined with Catherine's and Pearl's records, created a multi-layered understanding of Sweetwater, a story of trauma, resilience, and partial justice. For many, engaging with Sweetwater was not just academic, it was therapeutic, a means of reclaiming identity and asserting the dignity of those who had been silenced. Contemporary reflections on Sweetwater also informed broader social debate. Activists and educators drew parallels between historical trafficking, systemic oppression, and modern human rights abuses. Catherine's meticulous documentation served as a reminder that bureaucracies and systems can perpetuate harm silently, even without overt violence. The story encouraged vigilance against dehumanization in all forms, highlighting the ongoing relevance of historical inquiry to present-day ethical challenges. By the early 21st century, Sweetwater had firmly entered public consciousness as a cautionary tale of human cruelty, the consequences of unchecked power, and the complexities of resistance. Academic conferences regularly featured panels on Sweetwater's history, descendants shared oral histories in podcasts and documentaries, and museum exhibits highlighted the material culture of slavery, alongside the documentation preserved by Catherine and Pearl. The plantation itself, now mostly reclaimed by forest, remained a site of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the intertwined legacies of oppression, resilience, and memory. Yet Sweetwater also forced uncomfortable reflection. Catherine's delayed intervention, while ultimately saving some lives, could not undo the damage already inflicted. Samuel, Pearl, Ruth and Grace, whose suffering Catherine had witnessed, carried scars that lasted generations. Their stories underscored the limits of individual action within a morally corrupt system, and highlighted the enduring consequences of complicity and delay. Sweetwater's narrative thus balanced tragedy with partial justice, horror with resilience, and suffering with survival. In the end, Sweetwater Plantation remained a testament to both the worst and best of human nature. Nathaniel's cruelty, rationalized by science and enabled by social structures, represented the extremes of human capacity for harm. Catherine's moral ambivalence, her eventual courage, and her meticulous preservation of evidence demonstrated the potential for resistance, documentation, and historical reckoning. Pearl, Ruth and Samuel embodied resilience, survival, and the persistence of memory, even when the broader system sought to erase them. The plantation, though physically diminished, had become a moral and historical landmark. Visitors walking the overgrown grounds or studying the preserved documents confronted the ethical questions raised by Sweetwater. How do we recognize complicity? How do we act when constrained by law, custom, or fear? How do we honor the memories of those whose lives were destroyed while preserving the lessons of history for future generations? These questions remained as urgent as ever, a legacy of the lives lived and lost at Sweetwater. Ultimately, Sweetwater's story is not one of closure or simple redemption. It is a complex tapestry of horror, complicity, courage, and preservation. It warns of the dangers of unchecked power, the moral hazards of delayed action, and the consequences of rationalized cruelty. Yet it also affirms the enduring power of memory, documentation, and human resilience. Through Catherine Brennan's diaries, Pearl's notes, Ruth's witness, and the descendants who carried their stories forward, Sweetwater continues to teach, confront, and remind the world of the cost of dehumanization and the imperative of remembering. Even today, scholars, educators, and descendants visit the remnants of Sweetwater, study the preserved documentation, and reflect on the moral and historical lessons embedded in its story. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, a cautionary tale of atrocity, and a testament to the power of human courage, even when it comes belatedly. Sweetwater, though erased from the landscape and nearly erased from memory, remains a living reminder of the consequences of cruelty, the complexity of moral choice, and the enduring necessity of bearing witness. Even as the 21st century unfolded, Sweetwater Plantation remained a silent witness to the horrors that had occurred there. Though nature had reclaimed much of the land, and the main house was long gone, the plantation's legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Local historians, descendants of the enslaved, and scholars alike returned to the fragments left behind, documents, diaries, oral histories, to confront a past that was at once personal and profoundly national. Each visit to the site, each study of Catherine Brennan's meticulous records, reminded those who engaged with Sweetwater that the cruelty of slavery was neither abstract nor distant. It had happened in specific places, to specific people, and its consequences rippled across generations. Catherine's own story had become emblematic of moral ambiguity in the face of systemic evil. Her hesitation to act immediately against Nathaniel's breeding program, and her complicity in the system she inherited, prompted rigorous debate among ethicists and historians.
Scholars noted that her delayed intervention highlighted a common reality for individuals in positions of partial power. Moral clarity does not always translate into immediate action, yet her eventual courage, the preservation of evidence and her efforts to protect as many children as she could, had left an indelible mark. She demonstrated that even belated action can alter outcomes, save lives, and shape historical memory. The descendants of Sweetwater's survivors continued to grapple with the legacy of the plantation. Samuel's lineage in Philadelphia carried the knowledge of survival, secrecy, and adaptation. Pearl's descendants in Boston preserved oral histories and artifacts, sharing them in classrooms, community centers, and museums. Martha's scattered descendants, though more difficult to trace, maintained a sense of connection to the past through family stories and genealogy. For each generation, the act of remembering Sweetwater became a means of asserting identity, resilience, and continuity, despite the trauma inflicted centuries earlier. Academic interest in Sweetwater remained strong. Universities across the United States incorporated the case study into curricula on slavery, scientific racism, and historical documentation. Students examined Nathaniel's ledgers, alongside Catherine's diaries, comparing the cold, methodical recording of human exploitation with the deeply personal, empathetic accounts of suffering and resistance. They explored the paradoxes of privilege and constraint. Catherine, a white woman, had legal and social power Nathaniel's victims could not access, yet she was constrained by gender, marriage, and law. Pearl and Ruth, enslaved women, navigated oppression with cunning, courage, and secrecy, wielding the limited tools available to protect themselves and others. Sweetwater became a study not only of atrocity but of agency, resistance, and the moral complexities of power. The physical remnants of Sweetwater, overgrown cemeteries, stone foundations, and fragments of buildings, became sites of reflection and commemoration. While no official marker stood to honor the victims of Nathaniel's cruelty, historians and descendants advocated for preservation and recognition. The plantation's story was featured in exhibits on the history of slavery in Georgia, emphasizing the realities of human trafficking, forced reproduction, and the bureaucratic nature of oppression. Visitors often left shaken, grappling with the scale of suffering and the resilience of those who survived. In local communities, the memory of Sweetwater influenced discussions of justice and historical responsibility. Public lectures, walking tours, and community workshops highlighted how systemic oppression could be rationalized, codified, and normalized. Reverend Brennan's role as both observer and participant prompted reflection on the moral duties of witnesses, how one should act when confronted with injustice, and how delayed action, while imperfect, can still make a difference. Her story became a framework for examining ethical dilemmas in history, law, and everyday life.
Legal scholars and historians also examined Catherine's foresight in preserving documentation. By entrusting her diaries, ledgers, and letters to the Baldwin County Courthouse with instructions for a century-long seal, she ensured that the truth would emerge when the political and social climate was less volatile. This act of deferred justice illustrated the long arc of moral responsibility, that evidence of wrongdoing can outlive perpetrators, delay the exposure of crimes, and ultimately empower future generations to understand, confront, and address historical wrongs. The publication of Fletcher's book, Sweetwater, a case study in scientific racism and domestic trafficking in Antebellum, Georgia, and its continued use in scholarship underscored the ongoing relevance of the plantation's story. Researchers traced patterns across other plantations, revealing a network of systemic exploitation masked by science and bureaucracy. Sweetwater was no longer an anomaly. It was a representative case demonstrating how pseudo-science, wealth, and social power were mobilized to justify human suffering. Its preservation allowed for the broader study of American slavery's most insidious mechanisms and their long-term impact on communities, families, and culture. Yet Sweetwater's legacy was not confined to scholarship. Descendants engaged with the story emotionally, spiritually, and morally. Reunions, oral history projects, and family research initiatives connected living relatives with their ancestors' experiences. For some, this knowledge was transformative, an understanding of their roots, a recognition of inherited resilience, and a reckoning with historical trauma. For others, it was a painful revelation of suffering that could never be undone. Across all generations, however, Sweetwater remained a vital reminder of history's enduring impact. In the final accounting, Sweetwater Plantation embodies both the extremity of human cruelty and the persistence of human courage. Nathaniel Brennan's calculated exploitation, rationalized by pseudo-science and social hierarchy, exemplified the systemic nature of slavery's atrocities. Catherine's moral journey, fraught with hesitation, guilt, and eventual intervention, demonstrated the capacity for agency, documentation, and resistance, even within constraint. Pearl, Ruth, Grace, and Samuel represent the resilience, courage, and survival of the enslaved, whose lives were nearly erased from history, but who left indelible marks through memory and testimony. The land itself, though reclaimed by forest and subdivided for small farms, carries echoes of its past. Overgrown cemeteries, crumbling foundations, and hidden artifacts bear silent witness to what occurred. Scholars, descendants, and visitors who walk these grounds confront the tangible legacies of exploitation, resistance, and memory. They carry forward the lessons embedded in Catherine's diaries, Nathaniel's ledgers, and Pearl's hidden records, that vigilance, moral courage, and documentation are essential, that complicity has consequences, and that even the most oppressive systems can be challenged, however partially or belatedly. Sweetwater's story remains a warning, a call to remembrance, and a testament to the intertwined realities of human cruelty and resilience. It forces the acknowledgement that history is never simple, that morality is complex, and that the consequences of injustice persist across generations. Through careful preservation of evidence, courageous intervention, and the ongoing work of descendants and historians, Sweetwater lives on, not as a place but as a narrative, a lesson, and a memorial to those whose voices might otherwise have been lost. In remembering Sweetwater, society is compelled to confront the depths of oppression and the potential for resistance. The plantation is more than a historical site. It is a mirror reflecting human capacity for both harm and courage. It is a reminder that memory, preservation, and ethical responsibility are essential to justice, and that even centuries later, the truths of Sweetwater continue to inform, challenge, and inspire. After Catherine Brennan's death, the world around Sweetwater Plantation changed dramatically. The Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and Reconstruction reshaped Georgia and the South, yet the land that had once held such systematic cruelty remained scarred, both physically and psychologically. For the formerly enslaved, emancipation brought freedom but not relief from the legacies of trauma. Pearl, Ruth, and their children navigated a world that was legally free but socially constrained, forced to reconcile the knowledge of what had been done to them with the ongoing realities of prejudice and exclusion. Pearl and Grace, resettled in Philadelphia, found solace in their new lives. They joined communities of freed Black people who shared similar experiences of survival and adaptation. Pearl became a teacher, working in schools for freed women and children, carrying forward the lessons she had hidden and nurtured in secret on Sweetwater. Grace, though marked by trauma, learned to read, write, and find agency in a society that sought to define her as less than human. Their lives embodied both the lingering pain of their past and the possibilities that courage and education could create. Samuel, legally freed at 21, carved out a life that honored both his freedom and his origins. Living under an assumed name in Philadelphia, he married, raised children, and achieved professional success, yet the weight of his early life never fully left him. The documents Catherine had preserved became his connection to a past he could not otherwise confront, a reminder of the resilience that had allowed him to survive. In family stories whispered across generations, the memory of Sweetwater persisted as both cautionary tale and testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Back in Georgia, Ruth and Martha faced a different reality. Remaining on or near the plantation, they contended with the dislocations of Reconstruction and the hostile environment of post-slavery white society. Their choices were constrained by local economies, land ownership patterns, and racial hierarchy. Martha, now grown, married and raised her own children, but the scars of Sweetwater's atrocities shaped her relationships, her parenting, and her view of the world. While Pearl and Grace benefited from northern networks of support, Ruth's experience highlighted the uneven geography of post-emancipation opportunity. As the decades passed, the physical remnants of Sweetwater Plantation faded further. The main house burned in 1867, the slave quarters were dismantled, and the land was subdivided. Nature reclaimed the fields, with kudzu, oak and pine erasing much of the visual landscape, yet historians, archivists, and descendants ensured that the memory of what occurred there was not lost. The sealed documentation, rediscovered in 1954, provided a tangible connection to the atrocities, resistance, and moral complexities of Sweetwater. Researchers meticulously cross-referenced Catherine's diaries, Nathaniel's ledgers, and oral histories, revealing patterns of organized exploitation previously obscured by time and social amnesia. Margaret Fletcher's scholarship ensured that Sweetwater's story entered public consciousness. Her work, controversial at first, eventually became foundational in studies of scientific racism, reproductive exploitation, and the intersections of gender, power, and slavery. The story of Catherine Brennan, often described as morally ambiguous, provided a nuanced lens to examine complicity and courage. Scholars debated her choices, analyzing the ethical dilemmas faced by witnesses with partial power in oppressive systems. The narrative encouraged reflection on the difficult balance between survival, intervention, and resistance under systemic oppression. Descendants' engagement with Sweetwater also transformed over time. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, genealogical research, DNA studies, and community oral history projects connected modern families to the plantation's past. Some descendants of Samuel traced the line of inheritance, uncovering the ways in which knowledge, trauma, and resilience had been transmitted across generations. Pearl's family in Boston preserved letters, diaries, and family stories that highlighted the survival strategies of enslaved women, particularly the use of literacy as a tool of empowerment and resistance. Ruth's descendants, scattered through the Great Migration, discovered connections to Sweetwater more indirectly, though exact genealogical links were sometimes uncertain. Community networks allowed for partial reconstruction of family history. These stories underscored the uneven legacies of slavery, survival and displacement, resilience and loss, freedom and the lingering effects of systemic exploitation. They also demonstrated the ways historical knowledge can bridge generational gaps, creating continuity even when formal records are scarce or obscured. The study of Sweetwater Plantation also influenced broader understandings of American history. Historians and educators increasingly emphasized the ways pseudoscience, bureaucratic rationalization, and social networks enabled systemic atrocities. Sweetwater's records revealed not isolated acts of cruelty, but an organized, deliberate attempt to manipulate human lives for profit and ideology. The plantation became a case study in the convergence of power, oppression, and resistance, demonstrating how individual courage, like Catherine Brennan's eventual defiance, could challenge systemic wrongs even under extraordinary constraint. Public memory of Sweetwater remained limited but persistent. Sites of former slave labor were repurposed, overgrown and largely unmarked, reflecting society's broader reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet scholars, descendants, and local activists ensured that the story endured. Publications, lectures, and exhibitions drew attention to the complex legacies of slavery, resistance, and documentation. Students learning about Sweetwater grappled with the uncomfortable truths of power, complicity, and human resilience. They encountered not only historical facts but moral questions. What would they have done in Catherine's place? How should society reckon with the aftermath of systematic exploitation? Even today, the land itself, divided into small farms and partially incorporated into the Oconee National Forest, offers silent testimony to the lives and suffering that once unfolded there. The stone foundations, scattered remnants, and neglected cemetery carry traces of the human stories buried within the. For those who seek it, the physical landscape offers reflection on both tragedy and endurance, a reminder that history exists not only in documents but in memory, place, and community. Sweetwater's story, through its documents, descendants, and scholarship, continues to challenge the narratives of American slavery. It highlights the ways human beings navigate oppression, resist in whatever limited ways they can, and preserve truth for future generations. Catherine Brennan's delayed but consequential actions, Pearl's courageous documentation, Ruth's care for Martha, and Samuel's eventual freedom illustrate the spectrum of human responses to atrocity, from complicity to active resistance. Together, they illuminate the moral, ethical, and practical dilemmas faced by those who lived under, and ultimately survived, the machinery of human exploitation. The tale of Sweetwater is not only about the past, it resonates with the present. It reminds us that systems of oppression, whether legal, bureaucratic, or cultural, rely on silence, compliance, and the suppression of evidence. It teaches that courage can be small, incremental, and delayed, yet still transformative. It urges preservation of records, oral histories, and memories as essential tools for understanding injustice, and it challenges every generation to consider the ways in which complicity, power, and moral courage intersect. By tracing the lives of the enslaved, the observers, and the morally conflicted participants at Sweetwater, historians and descendants have preserved a narrative that continues to educate, warn, and inspire. The plantation may have been forgotten by most, its physical structures reclaimed by time,
yet the story lives on in archives, in scholarship, and in the families who survive. Sweetwater remains a stark testament to the consequences of unchecked power, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring importance of bearing witness. The legacy of Sweetwater Plantation is thus a mosaic, a record of cruelty, courage, survival, and moral complexity. It challenges readers to confront history honestly, to acknowledge both suffering and resistance, and to carry forward the lessons embedded in the lives of those who endured its horror. The plantation, though physically erased, exists in memory, in documentation, and in the ongoing work of remembrance, ensuring that the atrocities and acts of bravery that occurred there are never forgotten. By the mid-20th century, Sweetwater Plantation existed primarily in archives and memory. The land itself had largely vanished into small farms, forest, and forgotten fields, yet the story persisted in ways that would continue to influence scholars, descendants, and communities grappling with the legacy of slavery. Catherine Brennan's meticulously preserved records, her diaries, Nathaniel's ledgers, Pearl's hidden notes, and correspondence related to the trafficking network were now recognized as critical primary sources. The discovery of the sealed box in 1954 by Margaret Fletcher marked a turning point in historical understanding. Her work, published in 1958, brought to light the full scope of Sweetwater's horrors, the organized breeding program, the deliberate separation and sale of children, the complicity of supposed arbiters of science, and the moral ambiguities of those who witnessed yet did not immediately resist. Scholars debated Fletcher's interpretations, but few could dispute the veracity of the records. Sweetwater was no longer an obscure tale. It became a symbol of the institutionalized cruelty and bureaucratic rationalization inherent in slavery. For descendants of Samuel, Pearl, and Ruth, the revelations were deeply personal. Letters, diaries, and oral histories combined with Fletcher's publication to illuminate hidden chapters of their family history. Samuel's grandson, Robert Cunningham, now understood the profound sadness his grandfather had carried, the shadow of a childhood forged under cruelty and control. Pearl's granddaughter in Boston recalled stories of resistance, secret teaching, and the quiet ways enslaved people preserved dignity amidst degradation. These discoveries underscored the importance of memory, of passing down truth even when it was painful, and of the role of archives in connecting generations. Communities in Baldwin County, largely unaware of Sweetwater's history, began to slowly reckon with it as historians, educators, and local activists revisited records and oral testimonies. The plantation itself left no grand structures to mark its presence, only crumbling foundations, overgrown cemeteries, and scattered remnants of slave quarters. But the stories tied to the land provided powerful reminders. Hikers wandering through what is now part of Oconee National Forest occasionally stumbled across these relics, offering a chance for reflection, recognition, and mourning for lives once bound to the soil. Catherine Brennan's life and choices remained a subject of particular interest and debate. She was not a simple heroine. Her delayed resistance, her complicity in the early years of Nathaniel's schemes, and her privileged position complicate the narrative. Yet her courage documenting crimes, protecting some children, and eventually confronting her husband, highlighted the limited but impactful ways an individual could resist within a system designed to neutralize dissent. Her story is a testament to the moral complexity of survival, the necessity of careful planning, and the consequences of delayed action. The moral lessons of Sweetwater reverberate beyond its specific historical moment. The plantation demonstrates how power, law, and ideology can be manipulated to dehumanize individuals systematically. It shows that oppression can operate not only through violence but through bureaucratic procedures, scientific pretense, and cultural compliance. It also illustrates that resistance, even when partial, carries long-term significance. Pearl's secret teaching, Samuel's courage in carrying messages, and Catherine's eventual documentation all contributed to the preservation of truth and the potential for justice, even if that justice was delayed by a century. In educational settings, Sweetwater's records became a tool for confronting uncomfortable truths about slavery. Students studying these documents learned not only about the horrors endured, but also about human resilience, moral ambiguity, and the importance of historical accountability. Oral histories were integrated into curricula, emphasizing the voices of the enslaved alongside archival records, creating a fuller, more nuanced understanding of slavery's complexity. Teachers stressed that history is not only about events but about ethics, choices, and the interplay between power and conscience. Cultural memory of Sweetwater also influenced broader conversations about systemic injustice. Scholars and activists drew parallels between past and present, examining the ways institutions can perpetuate harm under the guise of legality, science, or progress. The story became a case study in the persistence of structural violence and the ways ordinary individuals, both those complicit and those resisting, shape the course of history. It underscored the ongoing relevance of documenting wrongdoing and the moral imperative to preserve evidence, even when immediate action is impossible or dangerous. Today, the descendants of those who survived Sweetwater carry forward the legacy in both subtle and profound ways. Education, storytelling, and activism connect the past to contemporary struggles for justice, equity, and memory preservation. Catherine Brennan, Pearl, Ruth, and Samuel may be gone, but their actions, records, and courage continue to speak across generations. They remind us that even in circumstances designed to suppress humanity, people find ways to resist, to record, to teach, and to survive. The physical remnants of Sweetwater may crumble and disappear, but its story endures in archives, books, oral histories, and scholarship. Students, researchers, and descendants confront the reality of atrocities perpetrated under legal and social authority, grappling with the tension between witnessing evil and resisting it. The narrative challenges us to ask difficult questions about complicity, courage, and the responsibilities of those who hold even limited power within unjust systems. In the final analysis, Sweetwater Plantation is more than a historical site. It is a moral mirror, reflecting the depths of cruelty humans can enact and the courage humans can summon to resist. It forces us to consider what it means to witness injustice, to act or fail to act within constrained circumstances, and to preserve truth for the sake of those who come after. The legacy of Sweetwater, preserved in documents, memory, and scholarship, is a warning and a testament that truth, however long delayed, endures, and that human courage, even when imperfect, can alter the course of history. The story of Sweetwater reminds us that forgetting is easier than remembering, but remembrance is necessary. The children stolen, the women violated, the complicity of the powerful, and the courage of the marginalized are etched not only into archives, but into the moral consciousness of those who learn their story. And for those who study, teach, and descend from the survivors, Sweetwater offers both a cautionary tale and a source of enduring inspiration. The enduring knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings can resist, preserve truth, and safeguard the possibility of justice.